Thanks for being patient with that one. Somewhat disturbing because, if you're like 15 or 16 and you're hearing something like that for the first time, the only question that you're left walking away with is, gee, I hope I'm not a goat. Like, that's all I want. That's all I cared about. See, there's stories like this and stories like, what happens in Revelation 20 that just freak a brother out, right? They just do. And when I was like 16, I was reading through the Bible the first time, and I was going through Matthew, and I stopped at this passage, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And when I was reading this, it was like there was like a famous book that was going out, like movie series called Left Behind, that was like freaking people out. And you see bumper stickers on people's cars that said, warning, in case of a rapture, this vehicle will be unmanned or womaned. But it was just freaking me out. I'm like, what is this rapture? And I see this thing in 1 Thessalonians about these two people working in the field, and one is caught up in the sky, and the other one is left wondering what had happened. And so there's this idea of this rapture where half of humanity disappears. Not the Thanos snap, but something different. But very similar, though. Right? Where do you think they got that from, dude? This is straight out of Thessalonians, Revelations. It's crazy. And then there's this tribulation period that they talk about where everyone's going to suffer, and they're like, oh, maybe Jesus was just all right with me. So people start coming to Jesus during this tribulation period, and then Jesus comes to judge people. That story, where he divides the nations into two groups of people like a shepherd would divide sheep and goats, because shepherds, right? And then so I'm hearing this stuff for the first time, and I'm like 16 years old, and I'm like, you know what? I don't want to be left behind. Like, that's the last thing I want to happen. So in Revelation, they talk about how this judgment thing that Jesus does happens, but before the judgment, there's a couple things that take place. So one of them is like this, tribulation. The skies start turning red, and there's lots of wars and earthquakes and things like that, and pestilence and things. And at the time, I was living in Santa Monica in a boys' home, and I'm learning about this. My parents are gone, and I don't really have any friends, and I'm learning about this on the radio. And every day, around 5:30 in Santa Monica, if you know the fog situation there, or the smog situation, when the sun starts to set, it just hits the atmosphere at a certain angle where everything looks red. And I would freak out. So what I would do is I would just listen to like Christian talk radio for the latest rapture report. If something would happen, they would know about it, right? So I would have my Walkman on 24/7. And if you don't know what a Walkman is, just go to the Natural History Museum. I'm sure they found one, right? And that was I was in a lot of fear because I didn't know if I was an actual sheep or if I were an actual goat, because I didn't know what this meant. It freaked me out. Nobody explained it to me, and I actually didn't hear a lot about it in church. So the question that I'm going to explore, maybe you're going to explore today, is: are you a sheep or are you a goat? So that's the question we're going to try to respond to based on understanding this passage is, are we really sheep? Because the people in this story seemed a little confused, right? They seem a little surprised, both sheep and goats. So in this passage, it's really easy to think that this passage is about, hey, all you got to do is just, serve the homeless and you'll go to heaven. That's it. Right? You don't even need grace. You don't need Jesus, right? It's the people who fed the hungry, served the homeless, visited people in prison. Those are the people that go into everlasting life. But I don't think that's what this passage is about. See, this is not about the root of salvation. This is about the fruit of salvation. So people who are actually sheep behave a certain way. And this is what the experience of following Jesus kind of looks like. You're doing all these great things to serve people, and you don't even know that you're serving Jesus the whole time. Because you would have done it anyways. You weren't doing it to try to earn points. So how do you know if you're a sheep? That's the question. How do you know that you're a sheep? There's three answers. The first one, if you're writing notes, is You know, Judge Jesus is real. You know Judge Jesus is real and you're not afraid. You know you're a sheep when you're not afraid of judgment. Because it was never about your actions. It was all about grace. You know you're a sheep because you know that you're saved by grace through faith and not of yourself so that no one can boast. Ephesians 2:8. Verse 31, starting in Matthew 25, it says this. When the Son of Man comes in glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered to him, and he will separate the people from one another, just like a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. What sound does a sheep make? What sound does a goat make? It's a Taylor Swift song, right? Goats sound like Taylor Swift. Therefore, Taylor Swift is a... Never mind. Well, no, she loves Jesus, I think. All right. He will put the sheep on his right side. You're going to be the right side, okay? Because you're going to be right side. And he will put the goats on his left side. You'll be the goats. All right. Oh, this is turning into a middle school sermon real fast. So who is the Son of Man? Son of Man is who? Jesus. Why do we call Jesus Son of Man? Because it's prophesied in Daniel chapter 7 as the Messiah. The Son of Man is the Messiah. He is Son of God. He is Son of David. He is the Messiah. Jesus is all of these titles, okay? So just so you know that. Now, he will come in glory with all the angels, which is very different than how he came the first time. Very different. Right? If you read Philippians chapter 2, it explains how Jesus came. Because in Christmas time, we're like, oh, Jesus in a manger, that's all so cute, right? Jesus came cute, and then he will come in glory, right? See, that's what happened, right? Jesus emptied himself of his glory, Philippians 2, right? It's the great kenosis, right? He emptied himself of his glory and showed up as a helpless baby, only to find himself in the hands of people who were going to eventually slaughter him, right? That's how Jesus came, in humility, but the next time he comes is in glory. But by the time he comes a second time, it'll be too late, goats. It will be too late. See, why doesn't Jesus just come in glory the first time, right? If he showed up with super crazy battle armor with swords flashing back and forth and says, follow me because I'm God. It's a very Thanos thing to do, by the way. But the reason why Jesus does not show up and intimidate us is because of a theological term. I'm going to teach you a theological term because I want to make the most out of my $700 a unit. The term is called epistemic distance. Somebody say epistemic distance. Man, I only got 17 minutes. All right, we're going to learn this fast. Okay. Epistemic distance is the distance that God purposely puts between himself and us so as to not coerce your will, right? So that you do not feign obedience, right? If God intimidates me, then of course I'm going to pretend to obey him, right? He will have my obedience, but he won't have my heart. And so God purposely doesn't reveal himself in a way as to violate your free will. All right? Epistemic distance. So that's why when God shows up in glory, it'll be too late. But he's done tons of great things already. But, God showed his great mercy by allowing us to live and breathe and have an opportunity to come to him and to come to him and to come to him. So that on the day of judgment, we can be like sheep and not afraid. See, this is hard, man, because in high school I had a friend I was bringing to church, even here, and he raised his hand. He wanted to get baptized and come to church, and his family's Jewish, and he's like, my mom's a good person. And I'm like, I'm sure she is. And are you telling me that my good mom is not going to heaven, Kelly? I'm like, man, why do you keep asking me these questions? People always ask me these questions. I'm like, but you know what the reality is if you're a sheep, people are going to ask you this question too. So I just told them straight out, hey, listen, there's no good people in heaven, right? There's nobody in heaven that deserves to be there, right? That's it, right? There's nobody good enough to get to heaven, and it's not based on your goodness to begin with. It all hinges on Jesus. Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. So Jesus is essentially, that's Jesus' house. If you got a problem with who he lets in, you should probably talk to Jesus. And it doesn't matter what I believe. All that matters is what you believe about Jesus. So anyways, he stopped coming to church after that. But that happens. It happens. Because the truth is kind of narrow. And I hate to say that. And I don't want to get too far on this, philosophical tangent. But truth is going to be narrow. You can't have more than one right answer when it comes to truth. You don't want your surgeon being a relativist. You don't want your surgeon accidentally removing a foot when you came in to get your tonsils removed. You don't want truth to be fluid. It's very, very dangerous, and it has eternal consequences. So what's the difference between sheep and goats? Sheep and goats. And why would the shepherd separate them? Well, let me just tell you. I know because you're wondering. You're like, what's the deal with the sheep? Okay, so sheep and goats, they hang out together during the day. If you ever go to Jerusalem or, the Israeli countryside, which is really beautiful this time of year. And they hang out during the day, and they mingle. But at night, the goats get a little rambunctious and kind of dangerous because they have horns. And so the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats at night. But what you need to know is that sheep, they have something that is very, very valuable, and they keep producing it, and people benefit from it. You guys know what I'm talking about? Do you know what sheep produce that people benefit? Yes! Yes! Yes, they are so giving. Right? They just keep producing. Right? They give more than they receive. That's what makes them so valuable. But goats, on the other hand, you don't want to wear goat skin. You don't want to wear a goat jacket. Exactly. Right? They consume more than they exude, and they're not as valuable. And also, sheep don't have horns. They're harmless. They don't hurt. Goats, on the other hand, they got horns, and you need to watch out. I used to work on a farm, actually, for like 10 minutes, literally, and then yeah, exactly. You guys know me. I had the worst allergy attack, but here's the thing. Whenever I turn my back on a goat, you never want to turn your back on a goat. Don't do it, right? You never want to turn your back on a goat, because if you do, you'll get a hug from behind. And it's painful. It's painful. You never think this little guy with the hooves and the things right, just, can get you so bad. It sucks. Anyways, so sheep are harmless. Goats are harmful to everyone around them. Sheep, they exist in herds. They need to be around each other. That's their only way of safety is in groups. But goats, you'll find them often. They're really self-governed. They're really self-centered, individualistic. And one pastor said like this. I was researching on YouTube. Y'all know that sheep, they put their tail down. They keep their tail down, covering the bottom. But goats, they keep their tail high. And I'll let you come to your own conclusion. So, goats are prideful. Very prideful. So, the question is, are you a sheep or are you a goat? Are you harmful or are you harmless? Are you self-giving or are you selfish? Are you existing in community or are you siloed? Sheep know that judgment is coming, and they're not afraid. The second thing we know, or sheep know, sheep serve without keeping score. Sheep serve without keeping score. Sheep serve without keeping score. Verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, a kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when? When did we see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you something to drink, stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you, or see you sick and in prison and visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you have done for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. Again, it sounds like the moral of the story is, if you feed, clothe, and visit people in the hospital or in prison, you're going to heaven. Right? Wrong. Exactly. Because the verse says in verse 34, this is about an inheritance that was prepared before the creation of the world. So this was an inheritance prepared before the creation of the world, which is exactly consistent with what Romans 8:15 says, is that we received the Spirit. So if you are in Jesus, you get to receive a spirit that frees you from other spirits. Because whether or not you believe in Jesus or not, you are being influenced by other spirits that are trying to keep you in bondage. It's a kind of prison that maybe you feel the weight of, that you can't get out of. Whether it's an addiction, or whether it's an impulse, or whether it's a compulsion, it's bondage. Romans 8:15 says this, the spirit that you received if in Christ, the spirit that you received does not make you slaves, so that you do not have to live in fear again. Hold on. The spirit that you received is a spirit that does not make you a slave, so that you do not have to be in fear again. Fear of what? Fear of what? Fear of judgment. You don't have to be afraid of judgment, because the spirit that was given to you frees you from that type of fear. I'll finish it. Rather, the spirit that you received brought about your adoption to sonship, to daughtership. And it's a spirit that cries out, Abba, Father, Daddy, right? That's a translation of Abba. So you got to think of it. You were all slaves to sin. All of us are slaves to sin. At some point we were. And you got to think, this whole idea of slavery and adoption and inheritance, you ever think about slavery, adoption, and inheritance outside of history class, like slavery, adoption, and inheritance? See, I was listening to a British comedian one time. There's a black British comedian in front of like a huge white audience recently. And he's like, wow, isn't this amazing? Like, I'm a comedian and I'm funny, right? He said something like that, but in an accent, so it was awesome. And he says, you know the funny thing is, 50 years ago, this would not be a comedy show. This would be an auction. That's when people laughed, right? Which is horrible. But the truth is he knew. He understood. Like, we're not too far removed from what would happen. He knew that the way slaves were sold is that they were put on display for people to check them out, measure their teeth, check out their back to see if they were strong, measure them up to see how they would fit in their family of slaves. And that's what a slave auction was like. And all of us were slaves to something or to someone. But Jesus somehow came along and said, I want you. I don't care what it costs. I want you. I want you. I want you. I don't care what it costs. Even if it costs me my life, I want you. And he bought you with a price. But he didn't buy you in order to use you. He didn't bring you in to make you do something that you didn't want to do. So he brought you in so that nobody else can claim ownership over you ever again. But he went even further. Because it's one thing to buy a slave, but it's a whole nother thing to adopt one. So he adopted us so that now whatever Jesus gets, we get. Because God is the Father, Jesus is the Son, and so that we get an inheritance. The same inheritance that Jesus gets. So before I was literally worth nothing, and then because of Jesus, I have more value than I can ever think or imagine. And I've been given an inheritance because I've been adopted. I went from slave to son. Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. See, this is not about earning salvation. This is not earning right standing with God. This is about what it looks like to be a sheep. See, you don't serve people in order to be saved. You are saved, therefore you serve. Right? You serve because you are saved. That's the idea. You don't serve to be saved. You serve because you are saved. And I love that Jesus says, I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. You know what Jesus is doing? He's identifying with his people because he really was all of those things. He's identifying with the weak, the lowly, the least of these. And he says, when you do it for them, you did it for me. But these sheep weren't keeping score. You know why the sheep were not keeping score? Because when they saw the least of these, they saw themselves. They could identify. They knew that they were lost and Jesus found them. They knew that they were hungry for more and Jesus fed them. They knew that they were in bondage to sin, but Jesus freed them. And out of the grace and out of the overflow of what God gave them, they couldn't help but to unconsciously give it to people. They couldn't help to unconsciously give up drinking coffee for a week so that we could build water wells in Africa. They couldn't help paying for someone's rent who needed it. They couldn't help but give this person money at the gas station. They couldn't help but help somebody move. They couldn't help it. They didn't know they were doing it to Jesus. They just knew that they were sheep. And they knew at one point that they were lost, and so they were here to offer hope to other people. See, this is a story of transformation. This is not a story of how to get saved. This is a story of what it looks like to be transformed. See, Jesus left heaven, found us hungry, and he nourished us. He found us thirsty, and he poured out his blood and satisfied the thirsty soul. He found us naked, and he clothed us with the robes of his righteousness. He found us sick, and he laid down his life so that we can be healed. He found us in prison, and he set the captives free. So what makes the sheep do this? It's the grace. It's the grace from the kingdom of God. And if God's grace doesn't motivate you, verse 41 definitely will. See, verse 41 says this. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. Indeed, as much as you did not do it for the least of these, you did not do it to me. This eternal fire was never meant for humans. God's intent for humanity was to exist in a garden. You know that, right? And that was the perfect environment in which we can see God face to face and walk with him in the cool of the day. But we kicked God out of our hearts, and therefore we were kicked out of heaven. And between Genesis 3 and Revelation 40, God's been initiating a rescue plan this whole time. And like I said, The goats, selfish. Selfish. See, they didn't want anything ruling them. They didn't want anyone or anything telling them what they can and can't do. They wanted nothing but themselves. They were focused on themselves. They were self-focused, self-seeking. Every decision they made was all about self. But listen closely. If you want nothing but yourself in this life, you will have nothing but yourself in the afterlife. And that's the harsh reality, is that hell is filled with people who are sitting in seats like this. Michael talked about it briefly, that this is the sin of omission. See, sheep are convicted not by the things that they do. They're also convicted by the things that they don't do. They're also convicted by the things that they don't do. That's what sheep are convicted by. They're not just convicted by, the things that we do that are bad. They also see the person at the gas station or the grocery store or on the video or they hear about the Uganda trip and they're moved to do something. They're moved with compassion. And when you see or you hear stories of the least of these and you are not moved with compassion, I'm telling you, you may not be a sheep. James 4:17 gives us a fresh definition of the word sin. A lot of times we define sin as missing the mark or like making a mistake or, something, a violation. See, James 4:17 says, if you know the good that you ought to do and not do it, that is sin. See, it's a sin of omission. It's like when I don't study, I get a failed grade. Right? When I fail to study, when I don't do something, I fail a class. Or when I don't submit my taxes, I go to jail. Or when I don't stop at a red light, I get a violation. Or when I don't take a shower for a week, sorry. It's not about what I did that makes the difference. It's what I don't do that makes the difference. What you do for the less fortunate is just as impactful as what you don't do for the less fortunate. Your contribution is noticed, and your uncontribution or your lack of contribution is also equally noticed. So how do you know if you're a sheep? You know judgment is coming, but you're not afraid. You serve without keeping score. And you're convicted by something other than the things that you do. You're convicted by the things that you don't do. I'm going to invite the band up as we close. What is this passage about? It's not about being saved. It's about the fruit of salvation, not the root of salvation. And the reason why we serve is not to keep score, is because Jesus served us. It's as simple as that. And the tragedy of hell is that it will be filled with people who we thought were Christians because they showed up to church and they were in our life groups. But the overflow of their life did not look like this. They were more concerned with themselves than they were with other people. 1 John 4:7-8 says, if you don't love people, you don't love God. Don't fool yourself. 1 John 4:7-8 says, beloved, let us love one another. For love is of God, and anyone that loves is born of God. But he that does not love does not know God. For God is love. So let's not fool ourselves. We should be convicted by the things that we don't do just as much as the things that we do. See, the tragedy of hell is that it's filled with people who sit around us and live around us, and guess what? There's no amount of theology that will get you into heaven. There's no amount of giving that will get you into heaven. There's no amount of virginity that will get you there. And there's no amount of morality. It's always and forever will always be about what Jesus did and what Jesus has done for you. And out of the overflow of that kind of grace will change us and transform us forever. And if you do not engage the less fortunate, if you do not engage the less fortunate, with a heart of compassion, you do not belong to Jesus. So, what I want you to do, if you're uncertain about your eternal destiny, I want you to decide to give him your life. Selflessly. Like, not just the safe parts of your life. Like, give him your pain. Give him your hunger, give him your nakedness, give him your identity, give him your bondage, and let him clothe you. Let him feed you. Let him be your source of identity, your source of strength, and let him give you life today. Would you do that? And my prayer for all of us is that we would become like sheep who are more focused on serving the less fortunate than like the goats who focus on themselves and consume. Let's pray. Father, if there's anybody in this room who like me was confused, who like me was scared, who like me didn't know if I were a sheep or a goat, I pray that right now, with the time that they have left on this earth, that they would give you what they know. They would give you their life. They would give you their future. They would give you their dating relationships. They would give you their health, whatever you wanted to do. They would just give that to you. And they would receive, in exchange, eternal life. They would receive forgiveness of sins. I pray, Father, that you would help them today. Reveal to them the extent of which they need forgiveness. And I pray that you would grant them that forgiveness. And I pray that weight would just be off of them. That you would literally take that guilt, take that shame, and absorb that so that they can be free. So that they can be adopted. So that they can have an inheritance. And out of that gratitude, out of that grace that they've received, I pray, Father, that it would move them to love those who are lost, to love those who are weak, to love the least of these, to love those who don't look like them, to love those who do not act like them, to love those who are weird and awkward, who need a friend. Father, I pray that we would continue to live like sheep and not try to hoard and gorge ourselves like the goats, but we would give like the sheep. That we would be more focused on self-giving and not self-taking. Not to get favor, though, because if that's who we are. Because our genetic or our spiritual makeup has changed, has transferred from dark to light, from death to life, from goat to sheep. That you transform us now and forever so that we don't have to be afraid anymore of judgment. Because we have a spirit that gives us life. And we can serve freely because we have been served.